Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture. The present course is called Human Behavior, and in this course what we are going to focus is on what is human behavior, how do you study human behavior, and what is the need of studying human behavior. So the core to this course is studying human beings, and the most difficult thing that happened since the inception of time is studying humans. And why this is difficult? Because human beings don't follow predictive paths. Now, just like chemical sciences or physical sciences, where atoms, molecules, planets, and other objects follow some certain laws and can be studied, but human beings cannot be studied by following certain universal laws. And the reason for this is human beings want to study human beings, and that is one of the basic problems. So, science of studying human being is very interesting. One of the most primitive questions or primitive powers that human wanted was to control other humans. And this is very interesting because imagine a situation where you got the chance or you got the ability to control other people. Now, if that is true or that power becomes available to you, we could do wonders, right? We could control other people's thought, we could get into other people's mind, and we could predict what other people will do. And it would be a nicer world. But the problem is we don't have that power. So the best possible option, which is quite near to controlling other people, is studying human behavior, which is basically a probabilistic science. So what we could do is we observe what certain people do in a certain situation, and based on that make predictions of how someone would react at a certain period of time. Now that is the science of psychology, and that's what this course is all about. So in this particular course, what we are going to do is we are going to study those methods, those problems, those techniques which actually helped us to understand ourselves. And that is a very great power, the power to understand human beings and understand why human beings do certain acts, what they do, when they do, and what are the outcomes of whatever a person does. So this is the core of this particular lecture on human behavior. Now, since this is the very first lecture, what I am going to do is I am going to introduce the field of psychology or the field of human behavior to you. And in this particular lecture, I need to tell you a little bit about history, what entails the study of human behavior, and how do you start learning, and what are the methods of doing it, how sciences of psychology or the science of human behavior actually came through. All of these things we will learn in this lecture. Now, the problem that I am going to discuss here, these are not exclusive. There are many other problems besides the ones that I am going to name here. But these are just representative problems that the science of psychology can actually study. Now, let's quickly get into this course of psychology or the nature of psychology. So, before we start this lecture, let me give you a small snippet or a small story and tell you what psychology can do. Now, in the early 20th century, in the United States, students were not able to focus, or school students were not able to focus on the course. They were not able to read, and so the community decided that they are going to help these children, these younger adults, into studying. So what the community can do in this case, and this is the first, or I would say a very good application of psychology. So famous pizza chain came up to the school teachers and offering them help, saying that the students who perform very good in their exams, they would be given tokens by the teachers, and these tokens can then be later on exchanged for discounts and pizzas. And pizza is something that people really like eating, right? So it's rewarding, and it is a very good idea And so this kind of a paradigm was developed, or this kind of an offer was developed. So what really happened in that students? They started studying and performing well on their exams, and they started exchanging these tokens for pizzas or for discount on pizzas at pizza chains. And this thing was a very good initiative because children started studying more and more. Now, after a period of time, these companies became profit companies, and so they decided that they would stop this offer of offering pizzas. Now, then as soon as these pizza offers were stopped, and with that the performance of children and the ability of children to read, those went down. So children started performing more poorly. And so this was one of the good example to show that how an external stimulus and an external reinforcement or a reward can actually make people do better on certain tasks. And so what happened in this case with the students is that students were going to get something good, they were going to get something deserving, and they were going to get something that they really want, which is the pizza, and that's make them work harder on the test and earn good marks. But there is an extension of this particular approach, and I will discuss this extension in a minute. And this is a very good example to show that what psychology can do. So when they were children, when on their own, and when they were not able to perform or were not willing to perform good on the exams, at that time they were pushed or they were associated with using a theory of learning and with a deserving reward, and this deserving reward had the capacity to make the students perform better. And also the fact that after a certain period of time, when the reward was taken back, these children performed more poorly. Now, an extension of this project was completed where two groups of children were taken, and both this group of children were actually given some tasks, some puzzling tasks such as mathematical puzzles to play with. Now, both group of children actually started playing with these puzzles and tasks. After a certain period of time, one group of children were actually given a reward for playing, and other group of children were actually not given a reward at all. So, no reward was given and they kept on playing on their own. Certain period of time passed, and after that, the reward was withdrawn. Then it was found out that the children to whom were actually given a reward to perform better, to play with certain tasks, or to engage in certain mathematical puzzles and tasks, their performance decreased sharply. While on the other hand, the children whom were not given a reward and they played on the task on their own are performing in the optimal level. There was no deviation, there was no change in their performance. After some time passed, rewards were again given back to these children, and now it was found out that the children whom were not given any reward to start with, then when later given a reward to them, they performed at a very high level than the children who were actually given a reward. So here, why blocked the reward and then the reward was given? What could be the reason? The reason is that the children whom were actually not given a reward to start with, they started enjoying the task. They started enjoying playing with the task, and they were not doing the behavior or they were not playing with the task just for the pizza or just for the reward that was given to them. They were playing it because they liked it. And so when a reward was added to it, the performance increased. So what does this mean? This means that reward actually increase performance. So an optimal question here, or a question here, is that marks that people get are actually also a reward. And so should people be given marks because if you give marks then people perform better? So should people be given higher marks for performing better? Obviously the answer is no. These marks that people get are not actually reward, because rewards that you get are fixed, and so the marks that you get are not actually a kind of a reward or not actually a reinforcing reward. The reason is the marks that you get is the contingent upon your performance. The better you do, the better the marks. So marks is not something which is given to you or given to people in uniform manner. On one hand, the pizza which was given to children was in a uniform manner. So let's say one slice was given to everyone, but in terms of marks that we get on exams, it's not that similar marks are given to everyone. The marks are contingent or dependent on how you perform. So marks are not a part of a reward. It is actually manifestation. It is actually a measure of your performance. And so that's why they are not reward contingent. This is what psychology can do. And this is the power of psychology. Now, psychology or the human behavior through the method of psychology can actually make you perform an act which you never wanted to perform. So, this is all about psychology or understanding of human behavior. Now, then what is psychology and where does it come from? Let's get an idea of that. In this course, the human behavior is centered on the study of psychology, and so what we will be doing here is we will be introducing you to the concepts of what is psychology, what psychology does, and what are the methods of doing it, and what are the areas or what are the fields of psychology, also the sub-problems of psychology. So that is what we will be doing in this lecture. And since this is the first lecture, I will be just telling you what is psychology, where did it come from, and what are its history, what are the various methods of doing psychology, and so on and so forth. And the upcoming lectures, we will take up several other associated fields or associated events in psychology, like studying memory, studying perceptions, studying sensation, because all of these are psychological processes. So what we will be doing in the upcoming lectures is we will be studying these processes. And so we will be studying perception, sensation, we will be studying consciousness, we will be studying memory, social influences, and so many things. So how people behave in society, how to study people in a social group, what is personality, and also what is intelligence. So all of this we will combine together for this course of psychology. So let's start with looking at what is psychology. The word psychology comes from two words, which is psyche and which is basically mean the soul, or in some terms it is called the mind, plus logos, which is the knowledge. So psychology is the study or the knowledge about the soul or the mind. Now the question is, where did it start from? Where did the whole idea of psychology started? Obviously, we have established that it's a science. So, psychology is a science, and why it is a science? Because psychology does everything that the science does. Now, what does the science do? Earlier beliefs of psychology or earlier proponents of psychology believed that psychology is not a science, but the modern study of psychology says that it's a science. Psychology started from philosophy, and in philosophy, the main question in the 4th, 5th, 6th century was about consciousness. Now, about the idea of soul, about the idea of mind, and these were the questions that philosophers were looking at. But what they were doing was not scientific. Besides, they were proposing theories. People like Aristotle, Socrates, and other people, other philosophers, they were proposing theories. They were proposing knowledge. But then they were not able to scientifically describe what it was all about. And so, from philosophy, a branch broke in, a science broke in, or a field broke in, which was called psychology. And that branch tried to study scientifically these problems like consciousness, mind, and soul, and we will come back to that. So basically, what is psychology? Psychology is the study of mental processes and behavior. The definition of psychology says that psychology is basically a study of behavior and mental processes. And what is behavior? Behavior is any act that we do. Let's try and explain what is behavior. So, Somebody is angry at you and comes to you and slaps you. Reaction to this act is your behavior. How do you react to that act is called behavior, and this behavior is influenced by so many things. It could be influenced by your past experience, it could be influenced by your judging of the situation, and so many things. For example, if it's a hefty person and if the person who slaps you is big, tall and bigger than you might not think of hitting him back, but if he is smaller than you can manage him. You will hit him back. So this is basically dependent on the perception. This behavior of hitting back can also be explained by certain personality types. For example, certain people are aggressive, and so if you hit them, they will hit you back. Certain people are not aggressive or cool people in nature, so they will think back and then react later on. So this act of hitting back from the behavior is influenced by so many things and also informed by cognitive processes. For example, how do you perceive the situation to be? Maybe your boss hits you. You don't want to hit him back because you think of losing the job. But on the other hand, if your personality is different, you might hit him back and not think about losing the job. And so this behavior or the act of hitting him back is influenced by so many things. And what we will do in this course is study all these perspectives and focus on all these perspectives. So psychology is basically the study of behavior, how we act, and the mental processes, which is the reason behind the act. What do you think? What basically made you act in that way? So psychology is not just studying behavior of simply what you do or simply how you act, but also the study of mental processes. It is the study about the kind of imagination that you had, the kind of problem-solving factor or thought processes that emerge in you before doing any act. Now, this is what the scientific study of psychology is, and it is derived from philosophy in certain ways. Now, what philosophers were actually focusing on is studying the soul, which was closely related to the mind and consciousness. However, the problem was that the soul and consciousness cannot be scientifically studied. Psychology, on the other hand, developed methods to study the soul and consciousness. Essentially, the concept of the soul was difficult to grasp as it could not manifest or reveal itself. So, for studying soul, we have to observe it, but there is no way to observe the soul. So, the manifestation or the act of the soul or whatever the soul wanted was actually mirrored to something called the mind. And what philosophers wanted to do was, they wanted to study the mind as a means of studying the soul. Now, what psychology did was, it studied what is this mind and studied the scientific study of mind and consciousness. Its goal was to understand what the mind was and how it worked. Also, consciousness was related to this mind, which is basically how aware you are of your external features or your external environment. And what psychology did was, psychology aimed to study the mind but faced the challenge of how to do so since the mind is intangible. So, in the study of the soul, its manifestations were reflected in the mind. So, how do you study the mind? The study of the mind or study of what the mind does can only be done in terms of behavior, as it is the only tangible means of understanding what the mind desires. Now, let's take an example. Suppose I want to eat something. My mind says to eat something. Now, how do I know that this is what the mind wants? So, the only way to understand what the mind wants is actually watch the behavior. So, if my mind says I want to eat something, my behavior will describe it. So, I am going to a food outlet, buying something, and eating is actually a manifestation of my mind because my mind wants me to eat something and the soul wants the mind to do so. Now, soul knows the mind that it is hungry and mind tells the body to do something or to act accordingly, and the body does a behavior in compliance with the mind. So, for studying the mind, you have to study the behavior, and that's what psychology did. Psychology study behavior, which we believe is a manifestation of the mind, and this mind manifestation or this projection is the soul. So the studying of the soul or the mind in terms of behavior is the achievement of psychology. So psychology started studying behavior. And so what is psychology again? The definition of psychology is, it is the study of behavioral mental processes. So before we go further into it, let's quickly jump into some brief definitions of what psychology is and what it can do and what it cannot do. So the definition of psychology that I have already given to you, psychology is the study of psyche, which is the soul or which is the manifestation in terms of the mind and the knowledge of it. That is a very old definition. The most recent definition or the most accurate definition of what psychology is that psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes that I have already said to you. Now the question is, what is scientific study? As I said, philosophers were introducing theories and telling a lot of things about what psychology is or what the soul is, what the idea of mind is, and what the idea of consciousness is, and so on and so forth. But none of them were scientific. So how do I describe a science to be, or a body of knowledge to be scientific or non-scientific? And for that, you have to know what the science is and the basic understanding of the science. Science is a 4-part system, and most of us would have understood or would have studied this really early on in a class 8-9 curriculum, that what the science is. Anything of knowledge that can be observed can be called science. So you can observe a phenomena, you can replicate a phenomenon, you can verify a phenomenon, and also you can falsify a phenomenon. So these 4 are the gold standard of a science. So let's say each time a dog barks, I feel afraid. How do I know that this is a scientific study, or what is the most scientific way of explaining this? Can I observe your fear when a dog barks? If I can do that, then what I am doing is a scientific study. Can I replicate it? Replicate in the sense that, of course, in natural setting, if a dog barks, you will feel afraid. But if I can take you to a lab and make you hear a sound of a dog where the dog is not present, and if then I can get the same fear out of you, then it is called the replication. And so the knowledge that I am gathering is scientific in nature. Now, can I verify it? It basically means that each time a dog barks, or if I use some other animals which is more equivalent to a dog, and you get into fridge, which is basically a reaction of fear or demonstration of fear, then I am verifying it. And for falsifying it, if I can use this data and come up with another theory and falsify the result that has come up, then it's a science. So what is science? Science is basically using these 4 methods. If anything of science or if anything of knowledge can be observed, can be replicated, can be verified, and can be falsified, then it is a scientific study. And so for psychology, why it is science? Because it can do all these things. Whenever something happens, whenever any event happens, whenever anyone acts in a certain way, and if we can observe that, not only observe, if we can replicate that behavior, then we can make this behavior again and again. Or we can assure that the same behavior will happen again if same situations appear another time. This is called the replication. And we can verify that the person acts in the same way in other situations. And if we can falsify what we have approved earlier, then it's a science. And that's why psychology can be studied as a science, because it is basically comprises of these 4 observations or these 4 laws. So psychology is actually scientific study of what people act and what are the mental processes. Mental processes are those mental activities that happen within your mind. And things like memory, perception, thinking, decision making, all these are mental processes. These are covered processes in the sense that they are not visible to you, but they happen in your head. And these processes actually make you take a decision, and so these are called mental processes. So basically, thinking, problem solving, memory, attention, decision making, and all these are mental processes. Now, psychology itself is a very broad in its scope. As I said, it starts with management on one side and neuropsychology on the other side. So there are various fields of it, or the scope of psychology is very broad. So some of the topics that I have mentioned here which can be studied in psychology. For example, face recognition. Now, a very specific area of the brain which we called the fusiform gyrus actually helps you in recognizing faces. So a damage to this area of fusiform gyrus, or the FFA, which means fusiform face area, actually make you not recognize famous faces or any faces for that matter. And this is called the prosopagnosia. This term of not recognizing faces is called prosopagnosia. Now, psychology goes ahead and tell you why this face recognition is not possible, and there has been cases for it. So people have studied where they have damage to this area which make them not study or make them not understand people or make them not recognize people at all. This has been studied by several people, and one curious case or exciting case that has been developed in face recognition was a person who was actually sitting in a restaurant, and he complained the waiter that somebody was looking at him. The waiter pointed very quietly and gently to him, saying that, "Sir, it's a mirror." Now look at the broad scope of it. Look at the problem that is happening here. The person cannot recognize himself. A very famous book which was written by a very famous author, neuropsychologist Oliver Sacks, is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Tales. And that book, where he demonstrated how this prosopagnosia, which is the damage to the fusiform area of the brain, actually not lets you recognize any faces. Other than that, you can recognize anything and everything. And so, one dimension of psychology, or one good dimension of psychology, is a study of face recognition. Now, social judgment. So, another interesting problem that can be studied in psychology is the idea of social judgments. Now, what does this social judgment mean? Let's say you are standing in a queue. Now, you are in a supermarket standing in a very big queue, and what you observe is that there is a lady who is taking some supplies, some grocery supplies maybe, and now what happens is somebody appears suddenly in front of this lady and says that, "I want to collect some charity." And the lady gives some money to the charity. Now, what do you think? What do you think about this lady? You think the lady is altruistic, the lady is very generous, and most people will actually tell that this lady is very generous and very good at giving things, and she likes to help people. But is that true? It might not be true. She is doing it because other people are in front of her and other people are present in front of her, and that is the reason why she is doing this. And if we study this lady at some point of other time, we may not see herself as generous. This is because while in supermarket queue, the other people are there who are evaluating her. She does not want to look non-generous and non-empathetic at that moment. Thus, she gives some money to this charity. But if no one is there, and if we observe this lady, we might discover that she is not particularly generous. Now, how did we decide that this lady is kind? The tendency people have to overemphasize personal characteristics and ignore situational factors while judging other people's behavior is called the fundamental attribution error. Because of the fundamental attribution error, we tend to believe that others do bad things because they are bad people. Same as if they do good things, so we think that they are good people. we are tending to ignore situational factors that might have played a role. And so, social judgments are thus a very good example of study of psychology. So, when we are looking at other people's behavior, we hold their personality or their traits that are responsible for whatever behavior they are doing and ignore other situational factors around. This is called the fundamental attribution error. And so, the study of fundamental attribution error is basically a subfield of psychology which can be studied. But there is a deviance. The deviance is when we study other people's behavior, we believe that their core personality is responsible for their behavior. But when we are studying our own behavior, we hold the situation responsible. So let's say two people sit for an exam, you and your friend. Now your friend failed in the exam. So what is the reason? Why did he fail? You believe that he was a bad student, he was poor, he was not studying hard, and that is called the fundamental attribution error because you put more weight on his personality type. Now you sit in an exam, you fail in the exam. Now what is the reason? Most people describe this as the test was hard and the situation was bad and the room was all warm and the situation was not good and the environment was not good. Also, disturbance was there, noise was there, and so many other reasons. You never hold yourself responsible. And so, this basic act of holding environment responsible for your behavior, and in the first scenario, his trait or personality responsible for his behavior is called the fundamental attribution error. And this is a good example of what psychology can do. Now, memory. So, study of memory, for example, there is a type of disorder in memory where people lose their short-term memory. In those cases, what really happens is people are not able to recognize anyone. People who have lost a certain area of the brain, which is known as the middle temporal lobe, they are not able to recognize, they are not able to form short-term memories. So think of a person who is talking to you and asking you every 5 minutes, who are you? And so that kind of a thing. And how things are stored in memory? How do you store factual information such as arithmetic rules, where America is, and other geographical rules or knowledges? And how do you store different episodes of our life? For example, relating to your birthday, relating to what happened on some other day or some other event. How do you store all these things? Those are also fall into scope of psychology or the study of psychology. Now, obesity. So, now we are studying the reason of obesity. A lot of people in this world are obese, and that's a great problem. So most people who are obese, studying the reason behind obesity, and psychology can help you to do that. So why do people overeat? One reason is psychology predicts that some people who have been deprived of eating at some point of time in their childhood actually overeat. And the other reason is that depression makes you eat more and more, and that is another problem that can be studied with psychology. Now, violence. Why do people do violence? Why do people turn up to be aggressive? And one reason that psychology has provided is that people who do violence actually think that they get reward with it. And so, here also a very simple experiment was done with two groups of children. One group of children was actually shown a violent film, and the other group of children was not shown a violent film. And later on, both of the group of children was exposed to something called Bobo doll, which is basically a harmless doll. And the people who saw violence or children who saw violent films reacted violently to that doll, whereas children who were not seen a violent film, they reacted very normally to the doll. So it's believed that these films actually induce violence. Now there are two theories to it. One theory says that this movie actually makes children realize that when the hero does violence, he gets rewarded. And so they learn this and they do this violence to the Bobo doll. But the other group of children actually never saw that anybody got rewarded because of violence, so they did not follow it. And so psychology gives an answer, but there is another approach. It basically says that when children do violence, they actually let out the cathartic feelings, and because of that, they should feel good. But then there are oppositions, and there is a debate which is going on, but we will not get into that debate. What we can do is, we can study the reason behind the violence, and there are many other problems that can be studied through psychology. I already said that the scope of psychology goes from studying management to studying neuropsychology or studying the brain. So why psychology is scientific? Now, one of the good things about psychology and why it is scientific is that psychologists not only research but also design experiments to understand the psychological processes behind any act, and not only that, they bring up theories with that which they can evaluate later on. So, research is conducted to learn more about how people think and behave, and different studies may find different results. They do a different kind of study which sometimes negate each other or sometimes add on to each other, and that is why the nature of psychology is scientific. So, the nature of psychology is scientific because we can not only observe, replicate and verify, we can also falsify any act or behavior. This is the concept of falsify. As a result, different experiments are conducted to examine at how people behave, and sometimes they add on to each other and sometimes they negate each other, and that increases our knowledge why somebody does something. Now, a little bit of history. The roots of psychology date back from 4th and 5th century BC and from the great philosophers of ancient Greece. Now, as I have discussed earlier, these philosophers, whether Socrates, Aristotle or any other philosophers for that matter, they were discussing psychology or thinking of psychology as the study of consciousness, study of soul, study of mind and so on and so forth. So, their goal was to study these things thoroughly. Now, most of these people believed that the people's behavior, the way people do certain acts, what they do, how they do, is guided by this consciousness, or the idea of what the mind is and how the mind functions. Now, since this is not a class of philosophy, we will not go into the detail of those, but if you are interested, then there are several books out there which will talk about the philosophical origins. So, we will stick to the basic principles of the scientific psychology here. So, what happened was that these philosophers were actually looking at philosophical concerns such as what is the nature of self, how anxiety develops, what is the concept of consciousness and so on and so forth. And what psychology did was, it took all these problems. It took all these philosophical problems and started doing research or started studying these problems in a more scientific way. And one of the most famous debates about psychology is nature versus nurture. Now, what is this debate about? Psychology says that our behavior that we do comes from nature or comes from nurture. And what does this mean? It means that the behavior that we do, any act that we do or any event that we respond to, whatever the way of response, our personalities, our memories, our attention process, perceptions, all these are innate in nature. Now, natural in the sense that it is brought down from father to son kind of a thing, and it is believed that our personalities, our behaviors, all are hardwired into the brain. So, the nature debate basically believes that most of the human capabilities like doing mathematics, singing or any other capabilities are related to how your personality is essentially nature dependent. Now, there were two groups of philosophers who actually working on it. René Descartes was one of those people who believed that most of the human capabilities that humans have, or most of the human acts that humans have, or most of the features that humans have are brought down from nature, which basically means that it is passed down from grandfather to father through genes, or that nature passes these things to you in some other way. So we are born with certain capabilities, and that's why Mozart was born as a good musician or Freud was born as a good psychotherapist. In opposition to that, here is another debate of philosophers which is called the nurture. The nurture group of people who believe that experiences can help you develop any capability or any human capability. So René Descartes believed that human abilities such as personalities, way of thinking and reactions are developed by nature and they are born with these certain capabilities. Another philosophical school of thought founded by John Locke believed that the mind is a tabula rasa at the time of birth. Now, what does it mean? It means that the mind has gone blank and has nothing to think about. So, as we progress and move through this world, our experiences shape our abilities, the way we are brought up in this world and the way we interact with this world. Our experiences actually shape our behavior and shape the self we are and also develop our abilities and so on. Now take a good example. So let's say Mozart's capacity. Because Mozart composed his first opera, which was a masterpiece, and he did that at 6 years of age. So basically, where did Mozart learn all these things? Was it nature or nurture? So nature people believed that Mozart inherited these abilities from nature, which basically means that he was born with these capabilities. Whereas nurture people believed that Mozart was brought up in a situation or brought up in an environment where he actually heard music a lot since he was born. Of course, his father and mother were trained musicians and he was always around people who actually develop music. So, no doubt that he was intelligent, but his capability to compose music was not inherent. So what happened was that the environment in which he was brought up that trained him to be the best musician in the world. So nurture people believe that once we are born, we interact with the environment, experience things and build our capacities from those experiences. Whereas nature people believe that everything is given to us or passed on to us from nature the way we are born. And that is one of the biggest debates which are out there in psychology. However, we now combine these two features with a new psychologists which take an integrated approach and study how nature and nurture merged to build human psychology. As a result, neither nature nor nurture are favorable to human psychology, but what actually happens is that today's psychology studies what role nature plays and what role your genes plays in who you are and what role your experiences play to become who you are. So, on the one hand, we have experienced your inherent capabilities or genes. On the other hand, they combined together to form that who you are. And that is what new and current psychologists are looking at. That's a historical approach or the historical origin of psychology. So one of the greatest debate was about nature nurture. The other debate was about psychology is a scientific science. As I already said, psychology developed as a scientific subject. So what is the science behind it? The idea that the human mind and behavior could be studied scientifically, which basically developed in the 19th century. In the 18th century, it was all about consciousness, or it was solely focused on soul research. However, there was no way to study the soul or determine what it was up to. The idea of studying the mind and behavior, or the mind as a reflection of the soul, or the development of the mind and behavior was created in the 19th century. The beginning of scientific psychology started with William Wundt, who founded his first ever laboratory lab in Leipzig, Germany in the late 18th century. Now, what William Wundt wanted to do was to study consciousness. And how would he study consciousness? He wanted to study consciousness in a scientific way. But how can that be possible? So what he was doing? He brought a philosophical technique from philosophy which is known as introspection. And he used this introspection to study consciousness. Now, Since he could not study all about consciousness and it was only demonstrative, he wanted to show that psychology can be studied scientifically. So he was basically focused on studying perception and reaction times. And so what William Wundt actually did was he wanted to observe how people respond to certain stimuli. So his first experiments focused on reaction times. Now he developed a scientific experiment in which a ball was dropped and there was a tapping machine in which anyone could tap. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to observe how quickly people could hear and respond to external stimuli. So when the ball hit the ground or a desk, a sound was made and people were instructed to respond to it. And the time between when the ball hit the ground and when the person tapped on a tapping machine was calculated and make a report that he had heard the sound of the ball that hit the ground. So that was the calculation of reaction time. And what method William Wundt actually using was called introspection. So now what is introspection? A person clearly describes what's going on in his mind. So when a person in this experiment taps on a tapping machine and hears the sound of the ball, he will actually describe what is going on in his mind through a verbal report. And that's called introspection. So introspection is a method where people analyze themselves or analyze their own acts and then report what is happening. But this was not scientific at all. What William Wundt was doing, he was analyzing reaction time. He was studying how quickly people hear and then act. Now, for the first time, William Wundt believed that the human body was a machine that could be studied by using scientific methods. This method of studying the mind and behavior has been used in the development of psychology. So what William Wundt was doing with his reaction time experiment, he was studying what the mind does and what is behavior. Also studied how does the mind influence behavior and is there any difference between the mind making a decision and the behavior acting on it. And also of course whether the mind and behavior are related or not. Therefore, the mind would tell the person that act, then mind will hear the sound and behavior will actually demonstrate that he has heard the sound. Because hearing the sound can be demonstrated through behavior by pressing the tapping machine, which will tell you that you have not only heard the sound but also reacted to it. Now, there are several early schools or schools of psychology that have started to develop and demonstrate what psychology was all about. So, the first two schools of psychology were known as the primitive schools, which believed that psychology was a study of consciousness, and while the last three schools was actually the original schools or the schools which believed that psychology was not a study of consciousness, it was rather a study of behavior and mental processes. Now take a look here. What happened was that when William Wundt was studying the mind and behavior, behaviorism gets started in psychoanalysis. So he was studying the mind in terms of mental processes. Actually, mental processes define the mind, not the behavior. So what happens is that the mind is basically a structure of mental processes, and these mental processes actually make the behavior. Because what William Wundt said was that there is something called the mind, but what is the mind composed of? And that is what these theories will say. Now, structuralism and functionalism. So let's quickly jump into the understanding of what structuralism and functionalism are. Now, these are the first two primitive schools. First, structuralism. So basically, what is structuralism or the structuralism schools of psychology? How did they start? It started with someone called Edward B. Titchener, who was actually a student of William Wundt. However, he studied Cornell University in the United States, where he started this school, this structuralism schools of psychology. Now, what was the school's focus? The main focus of the school was on how mental processes actually work and how does the mind function. And what he believed is that mental processes are just like any other hard sciences like chemical and physical sciences. Thus, mental processes can be broken down into its physical parts. For example, the taste of lemonade can be broken down into its physical sensations such as bitter, cold, and whether it is bitter, it is sweet, or it is cold, and so on. So, according to structuralism, taste, which is a psychological characteristics, may be broken down into physical properties such as bitter, which is a physical in nature, or say cold, which is temperature. As you can see, bitter and cold, these are physical in nature, and taste, this is a psychological in nature. And structuralism believes that any psychological concept such as taste can be broken down into its physical properties, such as bitterness, which depends on how many molecules of a certain curcumin you have added, or sweetness, which depends on how much fructose you have added. And all of this fructose and anything else can be measured. For example, how cold the lemonade is. The cold can be measured in terms of temperature. So, on this end, I mean bitter and cold, which are physical properties, and on this end, I mean taste, which is a psychological property. So, any psychological behavior or properties can be studied in terms of physical properties. And in opposition to that, functionalism came in and claimed that most behaviors cannot be studied in this way. And so, what the functionalism actually saw, or functionalism actually said, that most behaviors are adaptive in nature. And what does it mean? What is the meaning of that behavior is adaptive in nature? What it said was that for understanding a behavior, you have to observe a behavior in action. So you drink the lemonade and you feel bitter and cold, that kind of a thing. So this act of drinking lemonade and feeling about it cannot be broken down into bitter, sweet, and cold, and so on and so forth. It is completely up to you how you feel the taste. The same lemonade is different situations may taste bitter to you and sweet to you as well. So, depending upon the environment, depending upon your behavior, where you are, the same behavior can vary. And so, what functionalism said was, behaviors cannot be, or acts cannot be broken down into its constituent parts in terms of physical and psychological property. Rather, functionalism said that most behaviors are adaptive in nature. And in order to understand why people do certain behavior, what they do, how they do, we must actually observe the behavior in action when the behavior is taking place. So, these are two primitive schools, one opposing the other. But both of these schools were actually focused on consciousness. They were focused on studying the mind. And now, the problem was that there is no way to study the mind. As a result, a very important school known as behaviorism was formed. Behaviorism was started by someone called John Watson. So, John Watson is the father of behaviorism. And what did he say about it? He said that if psychology is to be considered a scientific science, then its data has to be open to public inspection. Like physical sciences, chemical sciences, and any other hard sciences, they provide data to people and they give some observation that people can see. So, psychology should provide data whenever an event happens. And if you have collected data on why an event happened, this data should be given to the public and the public should be able to verify it. And what structuralism and functionalism were doing was, they were using the method of introspection. They were using the method of consciousness. And they were saying that whatever psychological behavior exists, it's a part of psychology. In terms of structuralism, it is psychological versus sensation. And in terms of functionalism, physical and psychological properties can be explained, and also if you want to study human behavior, you have to actually observe it in action. But all of this is personal to people. People cannot view what is happening in their head. But no, this is not right. If psychology is scientific, what we have to do is collect its data and give it to the public. Now, there is no way to study the mind. So, how do you study psychology using behaviorism? So what behaviorism said is, in psychology, human behavior is influenced by something called conditioning and learning. So people behave in a specific ways because they have been conditioned to do so, because they have learned that certain activities are rewarded and others are not. And this process is known as SR psychology or stimulus response psychology. Now, what is SR psychology really means that? This is a very simple psychology. What it says is, when you do a particular act, when you get into a particular situation, you do a particular kind of an act. So let's say you get into a cold room, you wear a sweater. Now wearing the sweater actually helps you. It's rewarding. It is rewarding for you and you learn this. So each time you enter into a cold room, you wear a sweater because sweater protects you from cold. And so this act is rewarding, and once this act is rewarding, you do this act again and again. Now you enter into a cold room and you do not wear a sweater. Also you drink a cold drink. Now because of this cold drink, you actually catch cold. So this act of drinking a cold drink in a cold room will not be rewarded and it will actually make some kind of discomfort for you. So you will not do this act again. So being in a situation and doing a certain act, if it rewards you in certain way, people choose to do that act again and again in future. But if it does not reward you in certain way, people do not choose those acts, and this is called learning and conditioning. Learning is basically realizing that these acts are good and these acts are not good, and conditioning is giving reward for doing a certain act. So remember the first case of rewarding students? We discovered about giving pizza to students to increase their performance. And there we actually showed that giving certain reward actually made students perform better. And so what behaviorism says is that there is nothing called mental processes and mind and so on and so forth. People in certain situations act in a certain way. If the act that they do is rewarding, they learn it and they do that act again and again in future. And if the act becomes unrewarding, then they don't do this act, and this is called a simple law of effect. Law of effect says that people learn through association. If doing something in a certain situation is rewarding, they will do it again and again. And if it is not, they will not do it. And this can be verified because if a person is more likely to doing something in a certain situations, we can very easily predict that the person will do the same in this situation. For example, somebody who is afraid of horror movies closes their eyes while watching. And now, if we have established this, then we can easily predict that this person will close his eyes again when he goes to watch a horror movie, because that is rewarding for you. And so this prediction can be made, and there is no need for understanding his mind, mental processes, thinking or other things. It's very easy. So take this person into a horror movie, he will close his eyes, as simple as that. A stimulus leads to a response, and that's why he is responding, because it is rewarding. Closing his eyes actually make him less scared. If he opens his eyes, he will see the movie and he will become afraid. Thus he is closing his eyes, and this is called behaviorism or the proponent of behaviorism, where everything that psychology does is in terms of stimulus response, and with the response which are rewarded being learned and the response which are not rewarded being unlearned. So rewarded response means learn, unrewarded response means not learn. The fourth theory of psychology was the Gestalt psychology. When John Watson proposed his idea of a scientific psychology in which data can be viewed, then a group of psychologists in Germany established a school called Gestalt psychology, which was actually about perceptions, experiences, and so on and so forth. And what this school actually did was, they wanted to study sensory perception, they wanted to study sensations and things like that. The father of the school were Max Rethmer, Kurt Kafka and Wolfgang Kohler, and what these people were actually doing was, they were actually identifying the meaning of Gestalt in Germany. And what they said is, perception is influenced by the situation in which something is presented. So one's perception is influenced by one's environment. Now, how do you perceive things and how do you see things? So these people said that we perceive things in relation to two types of factors. First, how the background is presented in, and second, how it is organized. So how things are displayed in certain manner and the way things are organized together, this is how we see things. So if certain things are closed together, we perceive them as together. And the idea of this school brought us the knowledge of how people perceive motion, how people perceive looking at movies, and how we experience movies. There are 24 frames which go one after another, and since these 24 frames which are passing over the eye one after another, we actually see the movies moving. If we make only 22 frames or fewer frames, people will not see the movement because these 24 frames appear to be grouped together, and that is how we watch movies. So basically, that is what Gestalt psychologists proposed. They believed that perception is all about what situation is present around and how they are organized. Also, one important proponent of Gestalt, or say one important knowledge from Gestalt, is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. What is the meaning of this? So, the experience that you have by observing something as a whole cannot be equivalent to seeing something as a part. Now think about the favorite song that you can hear or your favorite song. When you hear the song, you will see that it has lyrics, it has music, it has so many other things into it. So when you hear the song with all the lyrics and music and everything, you will have a different experience together. Now take away the lyrics and just hear the music, or take away the music and just hear the lyrics, and again take away the music and lyrics and just hear the tune, and so on and so forth. Now, if you do that one by one, the experience that you will get when you hear the sound or when you will hear the entire song is not equivalent to just hearing this tune, music and lyrics alone on their own. So if you combine them together, the experience that you get will be entirely different from the experience that you get by looking at these three things on separately, which basically mean that the song itself as a whole, which provides you an entirely other experience. It means everything composed together gives you an entirely different experience than the tool played alone and than the lyrics played alone or than the music played alone. So basically, this is what Gestalt is all about. Now, the last school of thought or the last origin of psychology was psychoanalysis. So, psychoanalysis was founded by Sigmund Freud, and most of his theories are based on the idea that the human behavior is unconscious. So, if most people's desires or childhood expectations are not fulfilled, or if they are not worth fulfilling, then they are pushed into the unconsciousness. So, what is unconsciousness? Unconsciousness is a part of the brain or part of the mind which you cannot see, which nobody can see. So what Sigmund Freud believed is that our unconsciousness shapes our consciousness. How we are, what our personalities are, and things like that. So Sigmund Freud's theory is basically a personality theory as well as a theory of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy theory. What Freud believed that the behavior that we do or any behavior that we do is influenced a lot by unconsciousness. And what is unconsciousness? Unconsciousness is composed of all those acts, all those childhood desires, all those wants that we have and desires that we cannot publicly express. So those desires are pushed into the unconsciousness. For example, if you see a girl, you might wish to kiss her, but you cannot do that. As a result, this act of thinking or thinking of doing something is pushed into your unconsciousness or pushed into your mind. So, by not being able to kiss this girl, what really happens is that you show inappropriate behavior. So maybe you make a comment. So now this comment is actually a cover up of your desire that you wanted to kiss this girl but you cannot do that, and so the comment is actually a manifestation of the unconsciousness. Unconsciousness wants to show a behavior. Now this comment is actually a behavior which basically shows that you wanted to do this act, but since you are not able to do this act, it is replaced by this act or by this comment. And that is what Freud said, and most of Freud's theories about human behavior is in terms of sexuality, that most behaviors has sexual core or anxieties behind them. So most behavior has either a sexual interpretation or some kind of an anxiety or aggression behind its action. Any behavior is composed of these things, and so these are the historical origins. Now, modern schools of psychology. First of all, information processing field. Now, the 20th century started with some new fields of psychology, or the 20th century brought some new fields of psychology. One of the most important fields of psychology that was developed in the 20th century was called the information processing field. So, these schools of psychology that we had, which were primarily theoretical in nature and had data which could be verified to certain degrees, that become outdated with the arrival of World War II. Now, Second World War came up, and after the Second World War, newer equipments came in, new methods of doing things came in, and studying the mind came in, and so on and so forth. So now, the Herbert Simon in 1950, he developed information processing theory, which believed that human behavior can be studied in terms of the computer model. A computer with such a human-centric design may be created, and human behavior could be studied using the information processing model. So what is information processing model? It believes that humans are just simple processors and humans are machines that can process information. So they have an input system which takes an input. For example, your senses are an input system. Then your brain which you have, or the mind that you have, is actually a processing system which process information. And then your behavior that you do is actually an output system. So the input system like the brain or the mind process information, and the output system may explain any behavior that we do. And this is the first development of 20th century. Then human language. Another interesting field that developed in the 20th century was the idea of human language. What is human language, and what are the mental structures are there in human language? How do people generate language? Language is a very powerful thing, and the most basic thing and the most interesting thing that has happened to human is language. The most of the lower forms of animal do not have a structured language. They do have a method of communication, but they don't have a language. As humans, we have a language and we can communicate with each other. So, the development of language was a fundamental stimulus to the study of psychology, and so Noam Chomsky developed the concept of what mental processes are involved in language, how people make language, how they perceive language, and how language is formed. So, another interesting schools that they created in the 20th century was how and what mental processes form language, and how they are processed, and also how humans utilize those language. Next, neuropsychology. And the third important thing, or third important school that came up with the 20th century or 21st century was the study of neuropsychology. Now, neuropsychology is the field which actually studies how brain makes the mind. It studies the relationship between neurological events and mental processes. For example, specific parts of the brain show activity, so they are coming up with the MRI, fMRI, electrocephalogram which is EEG, and positron emission tomography which is PET. All of those machines actually showed whenever something the person does any act and any mental event happens. And these events can be captured through certain processes in the brain. For example, blood flow, certain activity in the brain, electrical activity in the brain, and so on and so forth. So there is always a simultaneously correlational activity in the brain. So if you are thinking about something, there is a brain activity. If you are considering about something else, there is also a brain activity. And these activities can be studied in order to make predictions about what you are thinking and what mental processes you are using. So if you are using memory, it's the middle temporal lobe. If you are using perception, it's the occipital lobe, and so on and so forth. So different parts of the brain have different ideas, and Roger Sperry was the key person who developed this area of neuropsychology, and he showed that the both areas of the brain are connected to something called commissural fibers, which basically means that the brain is split into two parts, and both parts of the brain are specialized for doing specialized functions. So these are the new development of psychology. So let's take a break here and let this information which has been given to you grasp onto you. Now let's do a quick recap of what we did in this class. What we actually did in this class is I explained to you what is psychology and what it can do. Also, what kind of problems do we study in psychology and what is its scope. With that, we went into studying some of the challenges, some of the problems which psychology can solve, and then we went into a little bit of history, looking at how psychology started, and we defined those questions which philosophers were asking, and we also defined how psychologists tackled those questions. Then we looked at some of the fundamental schools such as structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, gestaltism, and psychoanalysis. And what are the basics of these schools, how these schools tackle behavioral difficulties, and how human behavior can be defined. After that, I defined some of the most recent school of psychology, for example, the information processing school, human language or the neuro-linguistic school, and the neuropsychology school, and how all these schools actually handle modern problems of psychology. So we will continue with this lecture in the next class, and what we will do in the next class is we will take up a problem or a case. I will show you the various perspectives, the multiple ways of looking at one single psychological problem from different psychological perspectives. What we will do other than that is we will look at how psychological research is done. So thank you everyone.